drink there for anyone who wants it. And just to recap a little bit, welcome to the Mexican Mondays. This is our second session. The rich Blanca de Lomit, professor in the anthropology department. I want to welcome all of you, welcome our honored guest, Blanca Heredia. And just to recap a little on the tradition that we're inventing. So first, the wine is at the end of the table, is there to be drunk. And then after the talk and the discussion, there's a little reception outside here for those of you who want to stay and know about and continue the conversation. There are two official languages in this center, Spanish and English. Portuguese is welcome. French is tolerated. Kein Deutsch, bitte. No. So if you feel more comfortable raising your issues or your questions in Spanish or in English, that's fine. You're all welcome. And please come in, grab a drink, grab a chair. And in our tradition as well, we have, that we're establishing now, we have one of our graduate students introducing our thesis. In this case, we have Blanca Salgado, who many of you know, who is studying at TC, so therefore specialist in education, and she has asked to introducing our guest today. Final one or two announcements. Be sure to look at the schedule for the Mexican Mondays, because we have, the next one is not this next Wednesday, but the Monday after that. But then we have a Mexican Monday on a Thursday. You have to be very careful about that. Which is happening in the context of the migration forum. So please be careful with that, because it's on the poster. There's one of the sessions that is actually not on Monday. So welcome all of you, Blanca.
So it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Heredia with us. She's a distinguished political scientist, an expert in education and development, but most importantly, she's an alumna from Columbia University. She obtained her PhD in political science, and previously she also obtained a bachelor degree in international relations at the Colegio de México. She's currently professor at the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica CIDE, and she is founding partner at a consulting company specializing in education. Dr. Heredia, as you know, she has combined academic and important positions in government and international organizations that made of her an admired, pragmatic researcher. She has been professor and visiting scholar at El ITAM, American University of Paris, Georgetown, Northwestern, Torquato y Tella, UNAM, and Salamanca universities. And she has been provost of the CIDE and also dean of the college at American University of Paris. Also, she was director in 2005 of the Center for Democratic Development at the Instituto Federal Electoral. And also, she has been OECD's representative for Latin America and the Mexico Center from 2007 to 2009. And Commissioner for Political Development at the Secretaría de Gobernación from 2009 to 2010. You know that Dr. Heredia, she has conducted research in an area of areas. She's currently working on the relation between quality education and economic growth. And her opinion and work is highly regarded in this time where the education reform has been accelerated in Mexico. But she has been also distinguished by her research on institutional reforms and political economy of Latin American administrative reforms. She has also been consultant for institutions like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. And she has been also panelist in TV shows like Primer Plano. She currently writes for La Razón and shares her opinions in the radio station Radio Fórmula. And also, finally, she enjoyed as much as I did the Mexican telenovela Telesur, La Reina del Sur.
Thank you so much. Claudio, thank you so much, Vanya. It is not only an honor, but a great, great pleasure to be here in the context of the Mexican Mondays in this room that is almost exactly as I remember it, except for these chairs. These chairs used to be here when I was here about 20 years ago. So I really love how Colombia keeps its traditions alive. It's really a great, great pleasure. So, without further ado, let me start saying that I decided to get away from my comfort zone. For a number of years now, while talking about education, I do presentations that have a lot of numbers, mostly PISA numbers, the OECD's tests, and some ideas. Right? I decided to, I couldn't resist with some data, so I do have a little bit of data. But it's more of a reflection I'd like to share with you. Making sense of education these days is not easy for me anyway. There's a lot of fog, layers and layers and layers of fog. We know quite a bit about much that is, or appears to be terribly wrong. It remains unclear, however, what are the main factors behind that? What are the relative weights? The complex causal interrelations between things? How much does it matter? And what, if anything, can plausibly be done about it? All of this business about the fog started a while back as a little uninvited, an almost imperceptible voice in the back of my head. A voice that asked all kinds of important questions, all manner of uncomfortable questions, and kept insisting that her and I, this little voice and I, needed new glasses, needed other ways to look. Comfort, however, hates this comfort. So I just kept shutting out the questions, the smirks and the rolling eyes, day in and day out. And yet the little voice kept going, with the succession of utterly irksome questions such as, do you and I really think that education quality is one of the central causes of low economic growth? What is educational quality anyway? Who really cares? Will getting rid of the teachers' union hold over the education system actually change anything? What is it, by the way, that youngsters and children are supposed to be learning in Mexico for what purpose? I threw numbers and more numbers at this little voice. Robust research findings after robust research findings by eminent economists. But it just wouldn't give up. But it just wouldn't give up, this voice. And just went on getting louder and louder. As it became increasingly irritating, other voices, ones that I listened to and care about, said things about the world and the questions we ask about them that reignited my awareness about the need, at least every so often, to question one's assumptions and to actually look at one's questions. One of those voices was Claudio López, the other voice was Blanca. Quite unexpectedly, as I started to listen to this little voice inside my head, hardly became a bit less anxious. Then I found looking at education exciting once again. Certainties are very comfortable, but over time they have this nagging tendency of boring you to death. So I share this little recent personal journey of mine from certainty to doubt to let you know where I'm coming from here. It acts as a disclaimer, yes, about all the things I don't know, but also provides you a bit of a context as why I came to realize that dealing with what one cannot see clearly is that the first order of business is to actually attempt to see what's happening, what is it that is distorting one's view. So what follows is an attempt to describe this blindness, this fog, that makes it difficult for me, and I will here claim, for many of us to get closer to what all the talk about education in Mexico at present means, and about possible ways of getting ourselves a pair of eyeglasses capable of thinking about education and education policy in the country that are a bit less comfortable, but also hopefully a bit more fruitful. Okay, let me start with some indispensable history. Since the late 90s, talk about education in Mexico became increasingly frequent, increasingly intense, and increasingly loud. As a result, awareness about the country's very serious educational problems rose, and both societal calls for change as well as government reform initiatives proliferated. We were just talking a bit a few hours ago, Claudia, recalling when I was here in Colombia in the 80s. I can't remember, I wasn't following too closely, but I can almost assure you that never did education news make it to the front page of the New York Times in the 1980s. But something like similar happened in Mexico. It was not big news, it was not part of the front lines. It was something that, was for specialists and was in the back of the newspaper. A very important catalyst for the heightened salience of education in the public sphere in Mexico, as in many other countries, as well as of the increasingly strong pressures for reform, came from Mexican students' dismal results and their publication in PISA, the dismal results in the Program for International Student Assessments that was developed by the OECD, and these results were first published in 2001. Mexico had participated in some other international tests, but the results had not been publicly available. And there was this sense that there was something very wrong with education, but we didn't have really any numbers or any comparative measuring stick to know how bad those things were. In 2001, PISA, just made all these obvious. In Mexico, but in other countries, the best story is Germany, of course. Where they woke up one day and it turned out that they were the best educational system according to PISA in Europe. Finland, of all places. Anyway, so PISA had a lot of very interesting reverberations in a whole number of countries. Mexico was no exception. So during the early zeros, PISA provided all of these numerical data, rigorous data, on Mexico's huge deficits in terms of educational quality. Secondly, these results really pushed and ushered a shift, a complete paradigmatic shift in terms of what was the focus of education, research talk, and policy and everything, away from quantity, coverage, and spending to quality. And thirdly, it provided critics of the education system in Mexico and many other parts of the world a very powerful tool for change. So as all of these happens, and ever more terrible news, or similarly terrible news, came coming from every edition of PISA, and Enlace, starting in 2006, which is the National Standardized Test, calls for reform grew louder. Government initiatives for change in that sphere also became more frequent. Societal proponents in Mexico, which we must never forget are a minuscule little fraction of the population, despite the fact that they have a large microphone. Societal proponents of the need for substantial transformation of Mexico's education system diverged on many issues. There was one sector that prioritized educational quality above everything else, including, for instance, equity, and regarded low teacher quality as the central problem. There were other sectors among those pushing for reform that thought that quality was extremely important, but there were other things that were important. Equitable access, for instance, or pertinence, to what extent, what children learn in school was going to be useful for perhaps one day getting a job, things like that. And thought that surely bad teachers were not helping, but bad teachers were not the only problem. This is like this second group. And then there were many other groups that focused on specific issues like civil. There were a lot of groups, particularly on the right, who have hegemonized and dominated the values agenda in Mexico as in many other countries, about sort of like values in general, or moral values, or civil values, or whatever, or different, single issue initiatives and organizations. From the early zeros to 2013, two related factors provided reformers who were very diverse with a common focus and ended up defining the terms of the debate and the political battles around education reform. The first one had to do, and this had nothing to do with education substantively, but with the political organization of educational policy. The first one had to do with the notorious rise in the Sindicato Nacional de Trabajadores de la Educación, the main teachers' union in Mexico's political and electoral wave after the defeat of the PRI in 2000. That union was really the only corporate actor in the union front that was able to become independent from the PRI and gain enormous autonomous leverage over government. The second one had to do with the growing influence of the intellectual work of a small number of academics and policy analysts, as well as, and also small but very powerful, group pro-education media outlets and societal organizations, Mexicanos Primero most centrally, Periódico Reforma, and to a lesser extent Televisa, for whom the dismantling of CENTE's hold over the education system was the centerpiece of any informed voicing of that name. After the defeat of the PRI, in fact, the two administrations headed by the PAN, it became increasingly obvious that they were willing to cede ever larger parts of their control over education policy in exchange for electoral and political support. This occurs, of course, in the context of divided government. The PAN does not have a majority in Congress in order to be able to pass any major legislation. It needs the support of legislators there, especially from the PRI, who dominated by their governors, and governors are beholden to the union. I could go on, this could be a bigger talk, but generally that was the dynamics. All of this became increasingly visible due to one of the, I think, most clear and undoubted benefits of the Mexico's transition to democracy, which is a free press. So it became increasingly obvious that this was the case. It also became increasingly obvious that the union was extremely powerful and that its leader was apparently untouchable. These two elements provided a very diverse collection of pro-education groups in society to very effective axes around which to coordinate their efforts. First, a focus around quality as opposed to quantity. So let's stop talking about spending. Spending is not the problem. Let's just talk about coverage. Let's talk about quality. And that's the first sort of like focal point. The second one is, in order to be able to do anything about improving educational quality, we need to get the center out of education policy, essentially. We have to not have them controlling education policy. And in particular, we should be able to, and we should sort of like focus our attention on getting its leader elected more from her predominant position. As these two axes provided, since a very diverse set of pro-reform actors with this common umbrella, the debate about education reform became increasingly monothematic and polarized. Quantity, i.e. more coverage, more money, more teaching posts, against quality, i.e. results in standardized tests. Bad teachers against everything else. Calls for evaluation against corruption, and quite simply against the defense of the status quo. The ability of the pro-reform discourse centered on the need to dismantle center's power, the union's power, over education policy, and on the priority of educational quality, culminated in 2013. During that year, the new government surprised everybody, myself very much included, and managed to first indict and jail the leader of the union, La Maestra. It was top news around the world. And then it passed major legislation that aimed at recuperating the control of the Mexican state over education policy and wrested away from center. And secondly, and critically importantly, to reinstate the PRI, the government's control of over the union itself. This was not about them democratizing the union. It was about reminding Sente who was in charge. The government's decision to deal a huge blow to Sente's leader, to Sente by jailing its leader, led to a collective awe shock. You could also almost hear it. Everybody was calling each other. Turn on the news. They jailed her. Yes, where? Did this happen? No, really? Really putting her into jail? This is like, someone that's completely untouchable. I cannot begin to tell you how shocking this was. So, this produced this collective awe shock. And of course, all of this was couched in terms of the centrality of educational quality. So it seemed like, this pro-reform groups who had come together around quality and dismantling Center's power, hold over education policy, had won. So this was like an all-out victory, right? I don't know, it's like, I don't know enough about football to know which team could possibly beat another team that would be impossible to beat. Colombia. Is Colombia still terrible at sports? It's like as if the Colombia Bears or Cubs or how's they called? Lions, sorry, of course. Lions, Kings, of course. Kings College, okay. So as if, the Colombia Kings were to, I don't know, defeat Seattle. Seattle won yesterday, right? Anyway, it's just incredible. So a certain numbness comes out of this all-out victory, some paralysis. And once the dust began to settle, division, confusion among the pro-education groups began to emerge, becoming increasingly incapacitated in terms of their ability to exercise collective influence over all the details that are really important, right? The details of the secondary legislation. Some pro-reform groups abandoned the public fight for broad educational change and went back to their previous focus on handicapped children or on moral values or on this particular pedagogical technique, single issue matters. Others continued to attempt to keep the fire getting whatever they possibly can with effects in particular, which I'm very close to in many ways, but nothing else. And then Beccaro's Primer is the most important civil society organization that has been advocating for education. And a significant bulk of previously very active members of the pro-reform coalition simply turned their back on education and moved to migration and other subjects. This happened, all of this happened in like 1 year. Very, very small period. And I was fortunate, I guess, to be a pretty close participant to some extent, but also mostly witness of all of this. I was OECD representative in 2009 when the whole fury about PISA started, and then, anyway, I was involved in these things. So, okay, today, where are we now? I would say today it's fogginess and yet more fog. So what is this fogginess made of, and why does it matter? Well, the first part of the fog is that, using a very common metaphor, like you woke up, the witch was dead, but the insect very large and said, "You're still alive." So how could this possibly be? My master was in jail, and yet the educational system was not like changing for the better. Immediately saw all of these old corporatist forms rapidly emerging and congealing around, a powerful PRI in government again. Let me go back to education, what all of this meant, I think, or at least what it has meant to me. Imagine you're driving an old and rusty car. This was not too old or rusty, but imagine it is, okay? In an extremely bumpy and dangerous road. Imagine further that your car's lights are dim, that the gas pedal and the brakes take time to work and many times produce effects contrary to their intended. Say, you press the brake and it accelerates, okay, and vice versa. Most of the meters are off. Gas, speedometer, none of those work, right? They're completely unreliable. And you have a very, very vague idea of where you're going. Finally, imagine that you're not fully aware of none of the above because you left your glasses at home. And your sight is distorted by both dense fog and the fact that you're not wearing the glasses. It may sound somewhat exaggerated, but oftentimes that is exactly how I see the people running or attempting to run Mexico's education system, seeking to influence and to fix it, immersed in a tough ride with lots of fog, driving a defective vehicle, motored mostly by inertia, with little feedback, info to guide them, and with only a very vague sense of where they're going. Finally, armed with maps for places that have very little to do with where they're actually at. Denmark, we got this detailed market. Finland, Denmark. It's been great over. Okay, the deficiencies of Mexico's education system, education policy have been much discussed. Its dismal results in terms of access, quality, relevance have also received a lot of attention. Let me give you some numbers. Okay, this is for the academic year 1990-2000. 100 children started elementary, 80 finished elementary, 60 finished middle school, 36 finished high school. This is from a recently released encuesta de deserción en media superior in dropout problem in high school. We have very high prevalence of very problematic behaviors. This is middle schools in Mexico. In comparison, Mexico is the orange. The green is Brazil, and the bluish is the average for the 23 countries that participated in TALI's, an OECD survey of middle school teachers, who were asked, whose directors were asked about the prevalence of this kinds of behaviors that had negative effect on teaching and learning, such as theft, vandalism, verbal abuse, physical violence, and use and possession of drugs. The numbers are quite stunning, around 60% for many of them. Against Brazil, it's more in the 30s, and against TALI's, the whole universe, which is in the 20s. This one is, for me, really especially. Okay, this is from current work I'm doing with Edgar Franco on exceptional intellectual talent in Mexico. And we take levels 5 and 6 of PISA in math to be an indicator proxy of exceptional intellectual talent that's already been identified. This is a comparison of the distribution of students with 5 and 6 in PISA, which in Mexico is minuscule, 0.6. That's 6 in every 1,000. Whereas in countries with similar GDP per capita, it's 6 for every 100. not 600,000. But this one I really find just amazing. This is, you plot the number of, this minuscule number of 5 and 6s in math and PISA according to their income and sociocultural status. And what you see is that Mexico has seen that way. Of course, in absolute terms, the largest number of 5s and 6s in Mexico as in everywhere else come from the higher income groups. But as a relative percentage of the students in that group, Mexico has the fewest 5 and 6s among the richest sectors of the population. Education is not important to them. In a nutshell. It's much more important in Chile, a lot more important in Thailand, Turkey. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. This is, and I'm just giving you sort of like a bit of glimpses, some of the results of Mexico, of what we know about Mexico's education system. This you I can say before because I showed it in the last presentation I gave it, but I still haven't gotten over it. Between 2005 2010, 3.5 million more Mexicans had higher education, who were, by the way, 12% of the relative population. During that same period, the Mexican economy produced 500,000 jobs that required that level of education. So, 3 million. This is, I think, another great figure, also relating education system and the labor market. This has just come out. This is Heredia. This is not Warla. I mean, this is not a leftist organization. And it relates the years of schooling with income, your wages, essentially, and finds that Mexico's has that the level of schooling has gone really high up. And this is percentages of the U.S. Figures, but the income has not risen correspondingly, and that on average, Mexicans are earning 20% less than they should be earning, according to their increase, to their having gone through more years of school. This is also one of the saddest. Poorer families in Mexico pay a higher proportion of their income for public education than richer families pay for private education. How? Through something called quotas, which are illegal, but if you don't pay them, your children don't get a place at school. And where are you to leave your child? Let me use that to begin wrapping up. There are three elements, I think, that are the three most important components of what this thing I'm calling the fog that doesn't allow us to see clearly. First is, we haven't had really as a society a discussion about what we expect from our educational system. What is it that we want? To begin with, realistically or not realistically, but I'm going to simplify, but say the axis of the post-revolutionary state project was to produce Mexicans, to fabricate as in an industrial factory, as by the way was the case with the French educational system and English and the American. So how much do we want it to continue to be that? Is identity an issue? Not an issue. How much knowledge? How much competences or skills? How many values? How much? I mean, art, not art. Everything. In what do we want, essentially, an education system that is able to generate graduates that are employable? Not employable, for democracy, for freedom, for what? What is it that we're expecting from our education system? In the absence of such a discussion, really it becomes whatever the latest standardized test says. That it de facto becomes the guiding light, say, in education. So that's the first problem. We don't really know where we're going. Secondly, I think the debate, both in academia and in the public sphere, in part as a result of this little history I encountered, has become extremely polarized in a most unproductive way. You have one camp that says the problem is quality, and that's really the only thing that matters. And the culprit of that is bad teachers. Okay? And then there's the others, the other extreme, which says, no, what we first need is, well, we need quality and access and equality and all kinds of things. And the real culprit is poverty and underdevelopment. Once we end up with this problem of underdevelopment and poverty, then we can perhaps start asking schools to do things. Okay? And this is not very productive debate, because we don't get to answer the important questions, I think, as to, under what conditions, historically or geographically, are said to use more of the lingo in educational policy, extra school factors more important than school factors. And to what extent they're true. The third is that I think we need much more research and data on some of these issues. All of this is like 6 months old. This is really, all of this is very recent. Most of education research, and there's a lot in Mexico, and a lot of it of high quality. It's just not generalizable. It's of a different nature, of the kind that it's not immediately obvious how it can illuminate public debate about it. And let me just say to end that I don't know if this is, I call it a written version of this talk, the Falk production machine, but I'm not sure if I'm exaggerating. I might say it's one of the Falk production machines, and that is the elephant in the middle of the table, which is inequality, and has everything to do with this. Let me tell you why I think it might have to do, but this is more of a hypothesis. And unfortunately, I'm sure a lot of what I'll be saying now, unfortunately, for this great country that is America, will sound more familiar to you. Americans. Only 6-point difference in the Gini index. Incredible. Did not think I would live to see that. Okay, the content, the results of education policy, the modes and range of educational change, along with the nature and limitations of the discourses about education in Mexico, I would say, are powerfully shaped by two elements: inequality, brutal inequality, economic, social, and cultural, and the role of private education. This I'm really getting outside of the OECD's comfort zone. Mexican elites, middle classes, and all of those able to escape public education do so as fast as they can, one piece of it. According to research done by the Ministry of Education, kind enough to do so, in the case of the Federal District, Mexico City, they now have it pinpointed to. Once you get above 8 salarios mínimos, minimum wages, people just exit the system. This is very low. Okay, so elites, including most of those interested and or active in educational matters, such as myself, have all been educated in private schools. Well, in my case, just with K to 12, but still. We all have our children in private schools, and low mingle virtually only the people in private schools. So for us, for many of us, talking about the problems in Mexico's public education system, Mexico's education system, is akin to talking about, something in Tanzania, something far away. The large majority of the population that cannot afford to move remains trapped in the public education system. That is a road to nowhere. But that provides mothers and fathers a place to park their children for a few hours while they go to work. It's better than tying them to the furniture, which is the actual effective option. Organizations pointed out the great Albert Hirschman. Get feedback about their performance and useful stimuli for correcting their course in order to avoid collapse from two main sources, exit and voice. In Mexico's educational system, those with the strongest voice capabilities are not part of the system, while those depopulated have extremely limited resources, including time, interest, energy, for voicing their concerns and demands. In short, internal forces for effective change via active participation are not very strong. That leaves us with exit, right? As a source of change, as a lever of change. Problem, because in a context in which organizational death is not an option, do you see anybody shutting down the public education system anytime soon? Oh, we're having a lot of exit. We need to shut down this system. Well, no, it's not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen in Mexico, in the U.S., nowhere. It's going to happen. It just becomes, this increasingly, dysfunctional thing that simply is not closed down. So exit doesn't either work as a source for correcting course. And in the end, what happens is that a lot of the educational talk about education ends up being reflective of this deeper state of affairs. And, we don't really know what we're talking about, who really cares. Where school's central purpose, I'm exaggerating a bit, okay? But I do tend to see it increasingly this way. Where school's central purpose is to provide either a social club for the reproduction of your membership in a certain part of the social stratification system, or a parking lot. Talking about schools as places of learning becomes inevitably a bit vacuous, flimsy, and irrelevant. So, is there any way out? I would say, first it seems to me that we do have to start asking some of the tough questions. And I think it must start with asking, what do we want and plausibly expect from our education system? Let us just look at this number, for instance. What should be the policy implication? If we are, say, a consultancy firm or university, what do we recommend the Mexican government? Okay, right now, there's, the figures vary, but say between 17% and 30% of the age-relevant population is or has attended at some point higher education. The current government is saying we should take that to 40%. In terms of employment, there doesn't seem to be a great case to be made in favor of increasing the number of people going to university. Is this a problem that is solvable via educational policy? I don't think so. Unless the Mexican economy creates more jobs, it's not going to happen that more people are going to be getting better jobs. I.e., unless the Mexican economy generates more highly, jobs that require higher levels of qualification. At the same time, it is true that the only problem is not that only that we're not generating enough jobs. Part of the problem too is that the educational system is producing graduates who don't have the minimal skills in order to be able to get those jobs that are actually there available. So we have a double problem. And the more we talk from polarized extremes, one saying, no, it's the economic model, and the other one's, no, it's the educational system, the less we're able to, do things productively. So I think we need to ask some of the tough questions. We need to ask what we want from the educational system, and I think we need to do more research that is less couched in this extreme polarized debate about what's more important, bad teachers or infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have time, of course, for discussion. I'll field the questions if you like. Please, the floor is open. And you might want to begin just by saying your name and where your affiliation, since part of what we're doing here is creating a community of discussion and discourse. So just identifying yourself would be good. Okay. In the back there. Anna? Sorry, then
Well, I'm Jose Moya, I'm the director of GILAS and a historian of migration, global migrations. Thanks for very thoughtful walking and a bit depressing.
Sorry about that.
But that's okay. I mean, we have to face reality. In this debate between quality and resources, the idea that it's not about resources, it's not about extension, it's about the intrinsic quality, which by quality it seems I have become a synonym of anti-union, teachers' union, right? Is there a way of knowing indeed, in terms of resources, right, expenditures, how does Mexico compare to other countries in terms of per capita or per student? Taking into account the privatization, right, of education, primary, secondary education for certain classes, to see if indeed Mexico looks better than other countries, where Mexico stands in terms of expenditure, public expenditure.
It depends how you look at it. Yeah.
Can I just add a footnote to that question? Do we have a comparative of how much was invested per student, say from the 60s or 50s, or through each decade? Like, do we know how much the state and the government is investing per student compared to 50 years ago or 60 years ago? Are we investing less or more?
Okay, let me answer first. Incredibly, let me just a brief note about sort of the dearth of the kind of research and the numbers that we need. Only in last year, the first two important works on educational expenditure in Mexico were published for the first time ever. This is educational expenditure. It's 1 peso out of every 5 the government spends. So just to give you a sense of how much there is to do for all the young people that might be interested in doing it. But there's a lot of data also. Okay. Mexico, as a proportion of its GDP or its public spending, in comparison to many other OECD countries, Mexico spends a lot. As a share of its GDP, or it's even smaller public spending. If you look at it in terms of the absolute amount of dollars, it spends around 5 times less per student than what the OECD average does. That is, okay. So, in historical terms, I don't know, but I could guess that. But what I do know is that the composition per student by level changed dramatically starting in the 90s. Mexico used to spend about 5 times more per higher education student than elementary school student, and that changed a lot, and now it's only about 3 times, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't know, essentially, but that's not something that I think would be very difficult to do. I mean, at least a first take, you know, would just divide the number by the number of pesos. Mexico has, in Latin America, over the past 50 years, Mexico has increased, the increase of Mexico's expenditure, global expenditure in education has been just incredibly high, much higher than any other country in Latin America, which have also risen very high, very fast.